In this video, we're going to continue our discussion about media bias. But instead of looking at what I consider to be non-credible sources like the Media Research Center and Media Matters for America, I'm going to be looking at allsides.com. This is an organization that makes an effort, at least, to use the kind of tools that political scientists use to evaluate bias in the media. Now, I'm calling it credible science because they use those methods. It's credible because it's not clear what their conclusion is going to be before they do their research. At the same time, I don't think any of their research would make it into a political science journal because I don't believe it's rigorous enough to make it in a political science journal. But I think it's good, and it's certainly better than some of the other stuff like the Media Research Center and Media Matters. So before I continue, when they do their research, what they look at is online content only. They don't look at news on television. They don't look at the print media, newspapers, magazines. They don't include radio content. It's only online content. And they write at the very top of this little chart, ratings do not reflect accuracy or credibility. They reflect perspective only. So at least they're being honest in what they're doing. Now, the other thing about them, aside from the fact that they're only looking at online content, which is not where most people get their news, but probably where most young people get their news, is that they look at not only news articles, but they also look at headlines. And I find their focus on headlines particularly problematic. One, because the people who write headlines are not the people who write the articles. There are people who write headlines for online news sources, and they write headlines for one reason and one reason only: clicks. They want to get your attention. And so there are times when you'll see a headline for an article that's just over the top, but if you read the article itself, it's not nearly as over the top in terms of bias as the headline itself. So in only looking at online content, they're not looking at the media, right? They're only looking at a particular kind of media. And then looking at headlines, they're not even looking at the work that journalists do. They're looking at the work that headline writers do, which is very different from what journalists do. So let's keep that in mind. On this chart, well, actually, hang on, because I'm going to get a bigger version of this chart. So I want to show you what this chart is. On the far left, where it says the L, where it has an L at the top, deep, like a blue L, those are supposed to indicate, that's supposed to indicate everything in that column are media outlets that are very liberal. Then the sort of light blue are media outlets, where the L is, are outlets that are somewhat liberal. Then the center, the C, the purple C, are outlets that are centrist, that are like balanced. And then to the right of that, the R is the sort of light reddish R. Those are outlets that, according to all sides, lean to the right. And then to the dark red one are very conservative media outlets. So the ones on the far left and the ones on the far right are deemed to be the most biased, right? And so based on how they do their ratings. Now, the first thing that I would hope that you would see in all of this is this puts to lie the idea that the media has a bias in one direction or the other. There are some really big news outlets that, according to all sides, are on the far left. They have CNN on the far left. they have MSNBC on the far left. They have Fox News on the far right. Okay, so the idea that the media has one bias, one direction or the other, we can just throw that out right away. The other thing that I find interesting about this particular graph is that if you look under the far left, you'll look down, and if you go all the way to the bottom, you'll see the New York Times opinion, the opinion page of the New York Times. They say is far left. But if you look to the next column to the right, the leaning left, it says the New York Times News. They're making that distinction between news and editorials. They're saying, you know, the news part of the New York Times actually is a little bit left of center. But the editorials, those are to the far left. And I like that because they're making a distinction between news, people who are supposed to write the news, and then people who are supposed to give their opinions. Likewise, if you look in the bottom of the center column, the Wall Street Journal news they have as being centrist. If you look to the column to the right, if you look down third to the bottom, they have the Wall Street Journal opinion page, and they have that be to the right. It's leaning to the right. And so one of the things I like about this is it shows some nuance in their interpretation and their understanding of the media. They make that important distinction between news and opinions, or news and editorials. And I still think there are some problems with this, but it does give you, I think, a good idea of the range of news outlets. So I might quibble one way or another with where they have things organized and which columns they're in. But I don't quibble with the fact that there's a tremendous diversity in the news media in terms of left, leaning left, center, right, leaning right, and far right. I think they do a much better job of teasing out the diversity. And so if nothing else, what this graph should do is completely put to rest the idea that the media leans to the left or leans to the right. The media is very, very diverse. Now, with that in mind, I want to return back to something else I talked about. Hang on. In an earlier video, by the way, if you look down on the bottom right on your lecture notes, you'll see All Sides methodology. If you click on that link, it'll show you exactly how they do their studies. And I think they do their studies in a reasonable way. It's not perfect, but the way we did our study wasn't perfect either. It's really hard to study media bias. It's really hard. And so if you're interested in methodology, which probably maybe one of you might be, you can click on that link and you'll see it. But I wanted to explain to you why it was that a media corporation might have a outlet that is to the left and then one that is to the center or to the right. So as I said before, MSNBC to me is a media outlet that has a left-leaning, qualifies as the far left. There are some programs where I don't think that's true. Like their show in the morning is called Morning Joe on MSNBC. The guy who heads up Morning Joe, his name is Joe Scarborough. He's a Republican. He's been a Republican for many years. He isn't a fan of Donald Trump, so I think you could fairly call him anti-Trump, but he's a conservative, has always been a conservative, will always be a conservative. Another program that was on, at least in 2022, was Deadline White House. The anchor on that program was a woman named Nicole Wallace, or she may still be, Nicole Wallace. Nicole Wallace was the communications director for George W. Bush. So they have conservative hosts on MSNBC, right? But I still agree that taken on the whole, it's fair to say that MSNBC is on the far left, especially since the most popular programs, the ones that are in prime time, are people who are clearly on the left. But back to my original question, why does Comcast own a media outlet like MSNBC, which is to the far left, and CNBC, which I would put in the center or maybe even a little center right, like in the right column? Why would they own outlets with different ideologies? And that's because corporations don't care about partisanship. They care about profit. So if they can do a program that liberals are going to watch, that they can go ahead and get a lot of people to watch so that they can sell a lot of advertising, so they can make a lot of money, they're going to do that. And you see my mom in the background there? She's looking over and wondering what I'm doing. Hey, Mom, you got to wait. I'm recording for my students. Okay, I'll be there in 1 second. And they own CNBC because primarily conservatives watch them. And if they can get a bunch of conservatives to watch them, then they can sell advertising and then they can make money. Corporations want to make money. And the bank doesn't care whether it's liberal money or conservative money, as long as it's money. As long as the check clears, that's all they care about. And so one of the things that I think it's important to keep in mind is that you can have media outlets that are, or corporations that own media outlets that are all the way across the spectrum. As a matter of fact, News Corp, which owns Fox News, also owns some news outlets in Massachusetts. And I actually looked up one of the news outlets they owned in Massachusetts, that they own in Massachusetts. And I looked at the opinion page of that outlet, and that outlet was very liberal. Why would News Corp, which owns the Wall Street Journal, which owns Fox News, which owns the New York Post, which can be seen on this, on the far right-hand column, at least their opinion page, and then their news page is leaning right. They also own a very liberal news outlet in Massachusetts. Why? Because it makes money. And that's the thing that you need to keep in mind. People talk about how the news in the New York Times tends to be to the left. Why do you think that is? Because their audience, where they sell their actual paper, is New York. And New York is very liberal. Mostly the New York City, New York State, like there's a part of New York, Upper New York, that's actually a fairly conservative part, but most of New York is a very blue state. They always vote for Democrats, right? So part of the reason that the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, part of the reason that some of these outlets are liberal is because they're appealing to their audience. It's not a question of bias, it's a marketing strategy. Now, all this is to say that when we want to understand bias in the media, we need to be more nuanced in our understanding of it. Now, I'll conclude by saying this. When it comes to research done by political scientists, they are inconclusive on the idea of whether or not the media leans to the left or to the right. I know that when I was at UCLA, there were 2 different studies that were done. One which found evidence of a liberal bias in the media, one which found evidence of a conservative bias in the media. I'm not going to tell you who the authors were of these 2 studies. What I will tell you is that the author who found evidence of a liberal bias was a conservative. And the author who found evidence of a conservative bias was liberal. Coincidence? Perhaps, but probably not. And so with that in mind, what I'm going to do, and my main focus, is going to be to offer an alternative explanation for bias in the media. And the thrust of my argument is going to be that while there is clearly bias in the media, part of the bias that people see is their own bias being reflected back at them. They're seeing bias because they expect to see bias. And I'll talk about that in the next video.